Greetings and welcome back. I now turn to the last part of the page, Aristotle and his classification of governments. But before I do that, classifications of governments could be a whole course in and of itself. Certainly, there have been classifications based on wealth, right? Upper class countries, upper tier countries. They've often been called developed countries. Then there have been others that have been called newly industrializing countries, less developed countries, underdeveloped countries. Certainly, economics has been one way. Politically, there have been, Freedom House. If you go to Freedom House, you can see their classification, whether countries are free, partly free, or not free. When I was a young person during the Cold War, the most common classification of governments in the world was that countries were either first world, these were developed democracies such as the United States, Britain, France, West Germany at that time. This was before the reunification of Germany, early in the 1990s. The second world, which was the communist world, countries like the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, uh, Vietnam, Cuba, etc., and then less developed countries, which tended to be countries in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, etc. So I'm just giving you a case study. Once again, I've already told you about my love of Aristotle, but there is another reason that I use Aristotle as this case study for the classification of governments. First of all, many people, and I'm one of them, consider Aristotle to be the father of political science. He was the first Western philosopher to use comparative analysis to analyze different political systems, although ironically, Aristotle considered himself a biologist, and when he was on his honeymoon, he was out collecting specimens from the natural world instead of things that people usually do on their honeymoon. His classification system seems simplistic, but I like it because it's easy to understand. So Aristotle went around, looked at various governmental systems, and he actually tried to classify them based on comparative analysis. So the Aristotle scheme looked at two variables. The first is the number of rulers. So did the city-state in this case, because that's what he was comparing. This was before the formation of modern nation states, and I will talk about that early on, probably in a few lectures from now. So did the city-state have one ruler? Did the city-state have a few rulers? Or were there many rulers? And then Aristotle did a little bit of subjective analysis by looking at the intent, or what he called the character of the leadership. So, were these leaders worthy? And by worthy, he meant, are these people interested in the public interest? Or instead, are these people selfish? Are they corrupt? Are they interested only in their self-interest and making the assumption that their self-interest was synonymous with the society in which they led? And so Aristotle classified governments into 6 distinct categories. So the first category was looking at societies where there is rule by the one. Certainly, you can think of historical societies in the modern world with rule by the one, certainly in North Korea with Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. You can think about the Castro brothers, right? Fidel Castro. Even though there was a communist party, rule was really revolved around him. Certainly, you could think of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union or Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. I'm kind of giving you a who's who of bad guys in the world. You may think of some people who are more like Peter the Great for Russian aficionados. Many people say he's called the Great for a reason, right? So here the classification was a monarch if the ruler was worthy or interested in the public interest, or a tyrant if he was corrupt, interested in only his own self-interest. And here there is a split between Aristotle and his teacher Plato. Plato said that in a perfect world, a monarch such as a philosopher king or philosopher queen, and that is interesting about Plato. Here we have um, a political philosopher who made an argument for gender equity. Plato made the argument that a philosopher queen could be just as good a ruler as a philosopher king, that a female general could be as talented as a male general. So certainly that is kind of intriguing. Aristotle was critical of his teacher because he said, sure, in an ideal world, if you had a philosopher king or queen, it would be efficient and could be a great government. But in the real world, which is what he was interested in, um, there aren't perfect people, and therefore there aren't perfect leaders. Lord Acton, one of my favorite commentators in terms of I love this statement, right? It's a very famous statement. You've probably heard it, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so monarchies almost always degenerate into tyranny. And according to Aristotle, a tyrant is the absolute worst form of government because the sole motivation of that leader is power. And these people tend to either see themselves as the personification of the law or above the law. And so, in theory, a monarch could be the best political system in theory, but in practice, what we almost always see are tyrants, and they are the worst government. The second group of governments that Aristotle talks about is aristocracy, oligarchy, rule by the few. An aristocracy would be a government by an enlightened small group of people, and it's unclear exactly what a small group is. When I think about an enlightened oligarchy, I think about the United States Supreme Court. We trust our Constitution to 9 people. And if a majority, 5 of them, say a law is legal or a law is illegal, then those 5 people make the law for the country. Now, a corrupt group of people pursuing their selfish interest would be an oligarchy. And some of you may remember, if you took American government from me, very early in the American government course, talking about the iron law of oligarchy. And that concept said that in any large group, only a small group of people wield power or influence. And certainly you could make the argument that that small group may or may not represent the interests of the group as a whole. The third group is a polity or democracy, ruled by the many. Aristotle makes the argument in the real world, and I would underline those 2 words, in the real world, because I'm likely to ask this question on the exam. In the real world, the best solo model would be a polity. But a group may become corrupted as an individual might. In fact, Aristotle made the claim that people are easily corrupted. And Aristotle looked at democracy as a corrupt system where the multitude pursue their selfish interests rather than the public interest. There is a theory in political science called normative democratic elitism. And these theorists make a very interesting argument, and their argument is that the masses are very authoritarian. They're very dictatorial. They're very likely to want to deprive people who they don't like of their rights and their liberties. And therefore, you are safer safeguarding liberties in the hands of a small group like the U.S. Supreme Court rather than the masses, because they are more likely to protect those liberties and rights. At the bottom of the page, I have some stars, and I wrote, note that this classification system was well known by the framers of the U.S. government. Many of our founding fathers had read political theory, especially the ancient Greeks, and they were well aware that Aristotle concluded that the best system in the real world was a mixed system with elements of each. It would be a political system that would have a good economic foundation with a rather large middle class, but that you would have elements of rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many. And we see exactly that created with the American Constitution. We have rule by the one with the president. Certainly, the president is not the only individual in the executive branch. There are cabinet secretaries, there's White House staffers, there's people who work in the executive office of the president. But it is the president that is the leader of the executive branch. And the president has constitutional powers that are delegated, and the president has taken on powers that are not specifically listed, granted, are, as I called them in political science 1, enumerated powers. We see rule by the few. I use the example of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has had 9 members since 1869. There was one attempt to change the size of the court during the Depression, and that didn't happen. There has been some talk, given events over the last 5 years, of possibly packing the Supreme Court or enlarging the size of the court, depending on how you want to put it. But we've had a Supreme Court of 9 for 150 years, and my guess is that will probably hold. And of course, we have rule by the many. 435 members in the House of Representatives, 100 members of the U.S. Senate. Of course, there have been additions to this rule by the one, the few, and the many, with checks and balances and separation of powers and federalism, that are critical elements of the operations of this system. Certainly, you see the notions of separation of powers and checks and balances that Montesquieu talked about in his book, The Spirit of the Laws. But Aristotle's classification of government is intriguing and important for us because it is one of the most central reasons why we have rule by the one with the president and rule by the few with the Supreme Court, rule by the many with the Congress. So I think it's an interesting classification system. It's an old system, but we could probably talk about hundreds of different ways to classify governments and countries based on social or cultural homogeneity, history, economics, etc. But I thought I would introduce you to one of my favorites. So I hope you're having a wonderful day. Be safe while this pandemic is on, and we turn to a new page next.